You have a 9-digit number that follows you from birth to death. It is on your tax returns. It is in your medical records. It is what your bank uses to find you, what your employer uses to report your wages, what the IRS uses to track every dollar you have ever earned. It is required to open a bank account, get a driver's license, apply for a mortgage, receive a government benefit, or enroll your child in school. It is, in practical terms, the most important number in your life. The federal government created it in 1936 with an explicit, written, legally binding promise that it would never be used for any of those things. That promise is in the original Social Security Act. It is in the congressional debate record. It is in the regulations the Social Security Administration published when the program launched. The government told the American public, in writing, that this number was for one purpose and one purpose only: to track your Social Security earnings record. Nothing else. The card itself, the original card, was printed with the words "not for identification." You can see those words on cards issued between 1936 and the 1970s. The physical cards are in the National Archives. The words are still legible. The number is now used for identification. The cards no longer say "not for identification." Nobody voted to change that. Nobody passed a law. Nobody held a public debate about whether the most sensitive identifying number in American life should become a universal identifier for every institution that wanted one. It happened the way most permanent changes happen: incrementally, administratively, by agencies and departments and private institutions making individual decisions, each one small enough to seem reasonable, together forming something no one ever authorized. Let me start with the number itself, because the number is not what you think it is. When the Social Security Administration began issuing numbers in November 1936, they needed a system. 9 digits, 300 million possible combinations. The system they chose was geographic. The first 3 digits, called the area number, corresponded to the state where the card was issued. Cards issued in New Hampshire started with 001. Cards issued in New York started with numbers in the 050S through 134S. Cards issued in California started in the 545 to 573 range. The middle 2 digits, the group number, were used for administrative batching. The last 4 digits were sequential within each group. This means the first 3 digits of your Social Security number tell anyone who knows the system where you were born or where you first applied for a card. Until 2011, when the SSA switched to randomized assignment, every American's Social Security number was a geographic marker, a data point. The first 3 digits encoded your origin. The SSA published the area number assignments publicly. They were available in reference books, in government documents, in the kind of tables that actuaries and accountants kept in their offices. Anyone who wanted to know what the first 3 digits of your number meant could find out in about 30 seconds. This is documented. It is in the SSA's own administrative history, available through the Social Security Administration's official website. The geographic encoding was not a secret. It was the design. Now I want to tell you about November 1936, because the moment the program launched is the moment that everything that came after was set in motion. The Social Security Act had passed Congress in August 1935. Franklin Roosevelt signed it on August 14, 1935. The program would collect payroll taxes from workers and employers beginning in January 1937 and pay retirement benefits beginning in 1942. That gave the government 14 months to build an administrative system capable of tracking the earnings of every working American. 14 months. For a program that would eventually cover 150 million workers. The man responsible for making this work was a Social Security Board member named Arthur Altmeyer. He had been a Wisconsin labor statistician. He was methodical, detail-oriented, and deeply aware that the program he was building had no precedent in American history. No government had ever attempted to track individual earnings across an entire economy. The system Altmeyer's team built was card-based. Each worker would receive a card with their number. Employers would file wage reports using those numbers. The SSA would match the reports to the cards and maintain an earnings record for each worker. When retirement came, the record would determine the benefit. The number was the mechanism of the earnings record. That was its entire purpose. Altmeyer said this explicitly in congressional testimony in 1935 and again in 1936. The number tracked your earnings for Social Security. It did not identify you to anyone else. It was not a citizen number or a national identification number. Congress had specifically rejected the idea of a national ID card in the 1930s. The political opposition was fierce, rooted in fears of government surveillance that the Depression had not diminished. The original Social Security cards were printed with "not for identification" because Altmeyer and the board understood that using the number beyond its stated purpose would destroy public trust in the program. Americans were already suspicious of the payroll tax. Convincing them to participate required a narrow, specific promise about how their information would be used. The promise was kept for about 20 years. In 1943, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9397. It required all federal agencies that needed to create new record-keeping systems to use the Social Security number as the identifier for those systems. This was presented as a wartime efficiency measure. With so many Americans in military service, a single identifier across federal agencies would reduce administrative duplication. It was the first breach. Small, reasonable sounding, entirely inside the federal government. But it established a principle. The Social Security number could be used for purposes beyond Social Security. In 1961, the Civil Service Commission began using Social Security numbers to identify federal employees. In 1962, the IRS adopted the SSN as the taxpayer identification number, the number you put on your tax return. This was the largest single expansion of the number's use up to that point. Every American who filed taxes now had their SSN linked to their tax record. The IRS and the SSA shared data. The number was now doing two jobs. A man named Carl Davis noticed. He was a postal worker in Cleveland, Ohio. In 1963, he wrote a letter to his congressman, Representative Charles Vanek of Ohio, asking a specific question. When did Congress authorize the IRS to use his Social Security number as a tax identifier? He had not been told about the change. He had simply received a new tax form with a field for his Social Security number and a requirement to fill it in. He wanted to know the legal basis. Vanek's office researched the question and wrote back. The answer was Executive Order 9397, the 1943 wartime measure. There had been no new legislation, no public notice, no congressional vote authorizing the IRS expansion. A wartime administrative order signed 20 years earlier had become the legal justification for permanently linking every American's tax record to their Social Security number. Carl Davis's letter and Vanek's response are in the congressional correspondence files for the 88th Congress. They are in the National Archives. Davis wrote back one more time. He asked whether Congress intended to expand this further. Vanek's office said it had no information suggesting additional expansions were planned. In 1964, the Treasury Department began requiring SSNs for the purchase of savings bonds. In 1965, Medicare enrollment used SSNs. In 1966, the Defense Department adopted SSNs as military service numbers. In 1967, the Department of Agriculture began requiring SSNs for food stamp recipients. Each of these was an administrative decision. None required congressional authorization. None were subject to public comment. None were announced to the American public as a policy change. They simply happened, agency by agency, program by program, each one citing the 1943 executive order as authorization for what was becoming something far larger than a wartime efficiency measure. By 1970, the Social Security number was the de facto national identifier for every interaction between an American citizen and the federal government. No law had made it so. No vote had been taken. The transformation had occurred through the accumulation of individual administrative decisions, each defensible on its own terms, together constituting a fundamental change in the relationship between the American government and the people it governed. And then the private sector discovered it. Banks began requiring SSNs to open accounts in the 1960s. The Tax Reform Act of 1976 required SSNs for anyone receiving federal benefits and for anyone claiming dependents on tax returns, which meant, for the first time, that children needed Social Security numbers. Before 1976, most Americans did not get their SSN until they entered the workforce. After 1976, children were enrolled at birth. The number that the government had promised would track only your Social Security earnings was now assigned at birth and used by banks, by the IRS, by Medicare, by the military, by the Department of Agriculture, by the Treasury, by schools, by every institution that decided it wanted a reliable way to identify people and noticed that the government had already given everyone a number. No one had asked permission. No one had changed the law that said not for identification. The card still said it until 1972, when the SSA quietly removed the phrase. No announcement, no public notice, no explanation. The words that had been the program's original promise to the American public simply disappeared from the card. The change in the cards is documented in SSA administrative records. The date is 1972. The reason given internally was that the phrase had become misleading given the number's actual uses. The phrase was removed because it was no longer true, not because anyone had decided it should no longer be true. Here is the detail I cannot put down. The Privacy Act of 1974 was passed specifically in response to the growing use of Social Security numbers as universal identifiers. The act prohibited federal agencies from requiring SSNs for programs that had no legal basis for the requirement. It established the principle that people had a right to know how their information was being used. The act passed in 1974. It had no effect on the expansion of SSN use. The expansion continued. Banks required SSNs. Credit bureaus built their files around SSNs. Employers required SSNs. Landlords required SSNs. Universities required SSNs. The private sector was not covered by the Privacy Act, and the federal agencies found ways to continue their expansions within the Act's technical requirements. By 1980, the number that Arthur Altmeyer had designed to track Social Security earnings was the foundational identifier of American civic life. Your credit history was attached to it. Your tax record was attached to it. Your medical record was attached to it. Your military service record was attached to it. Your bank accounts were attached to it. And the card in your wallet, if you still carry one, no longer says "not for identification." The original promise is in the 1935 Act. The congressional debate is in the record. The administrative decisions that dismantled the promise, one agency at a time, are in the Federal Register. Arthur Altmeyer's testimony about the number's limited purpose is in the congressional hearing transcripts. The documents were always there. What was missing was someone willing to read them. In 1977, a woman named Mary Calvert received a letter from her bank. She had been a customer for 11 years. She had never missed a payment. She had a checking account, a savings account, and a small personal loan she was paying down on schedule. The letter informed her that her account was being flagged for review. The reason? Her Social Security number had appeared on a delinquency list maintained by a federal agency. She was not told which agency. She was not told what the delinquency was. She was not given an opportunity to respond before the flag was placed. Mary Calvert had no delinquencies. What she had was a Social Security number that differed from her neighbor's by a single digit. A data entry error at a federal agency had attached someone else's delinquency to her number. By the time the error was identified and corrected, she had been denied a car loan, had her credit card limit reduced, and had spent 4 months writing letters to agencies that had no formal process for receiving or acting on her kind of complaint. Her case is documented in the congressional testimony record of the Senate Judiciary Committee, 1977. She testified in person. Her testimony runs to 6 pages. It is in the National Archives. She was not unusual. She was the rule. To understand what happened to Mary Calvert, you have to understand what happened between 1962 and 1977. When the IRS adopted the Social Security number as the taxpayer identifier in 1962, it created the first link between an individual's SSN and a federal data file that existed independently of the Social Security Administration. The SSN was now in two systems. When Medicare enrolled using SSNs in 1965, it was in three. When the Defense Department adopted it in 1966, 4. When agriculture used it for food stamps in 1967, 5. Each of these systems was built by a different agency, maintained on different infrastructure, subject to different error rates, and governed by different rules about who could access the data and under what circumstances. And each of them shared the same 9-digit identifier, the SSN, as the key that connected a person to their record. This meant that an error in any one system could propagate into all the others. A transposed digit at the IRS could affect your Medicare record. A clerical mistake at agriculture could appear in a Treasury database. There was no central authority responsible for the accuracy of the SSN ecosystem. There was no process for a citizen to audit their own record across all the systems that held their number. There was no mechanism to correct an error that had spread from one agency to another. The Privacy Act of 1974 was supposed to address this. Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, the same senator who had chaired the Watergate Committee, was the act's primary author. Ervin had been warning about the SSN for years. In 1971, he told a Senate subcommittee that the Social Security number had become, without any legal authorization, a de facto national identification number. He called it one of the most dangerous developments in American government in the 20th century. His statement is in the Senate record, dated April 1971. The Privacy Act passed. It required federal agencies to tell people what information they collected, why they collected it, and how they used it. It prohibited agencies from using SSNs for purposes beyond their legal authority without explicit authorization. It gave citizens the right to see their own federal records and correct errors. It did not cover private companies, banks, credit bureaus, employers, landlords, insurance companies, universities, hospitals. None of them were subject to the Privacy Act. And by 1974, all of them were already using Social Security numbers. The credit bureaus are the specific institution that made the SSN's transformation complete. 3 companies, Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian's predecessor TRW, had been building credit files on American consumers since the 1960s. By the early 1970s, each of them held files on tens of millions of Americans. The files contained payment histories, loan balances, public records, employment information, and address histories. The key that connected all of this information was the Social Security number. A credit bureau's file was only as accurate as the data it received from banks, retailers, and other lenders. Those lenders reported using SSNs. The bureau matched the reports to existing files using SSNs. If 2 people had similar numbers, or if a lender transposed a digit, the reports went to the wrong file. The person with the wrong reports had no way to know this had happened. The bureau had no obligation to tell them. The error sat in the file, accumulating, affecting every credit decision made about that person until someone discovered it and fought to have it corrected. The Fair Credit Reporting Act of 1970 had given consumers the right to see their credit files and dispute errors. But the dispute process assumed the consumer knew there was an error. Mary Calvert did not know her number had been confused with her neighbor's until her bank flagged her account. By then, the error had been in the system for an indeterminate period. She did not know how long. The Bureau did not know how long. The agency that had made the original data entry error did not know how long. This is documented. The Federal Trade Commission maintained records of consumer complaints about credit reporting errors throughout the 1970s. The volume of complaints was large enough that Congress held dedicated hearings in 1974, 1975, and 1977. The testimony from those hearings is in the congressional record. Mary Calvert's case was one of hundreds presented. Now I want to tell you about the specific vulnerability that the SSN's universality created. The vulnerability that did not exist when the number was limited to Social Security earnings records, and that could not exist until the number became the key to every significant financial and government record in American life. In 1981, a man named Robert Miller was arrested in Phoenix, Arizona. He had never been to Phoenix. He had never lived in Arizona. He found out about the arrest when he applied for a security clearance for a government contractor job, and a background check turned up a criminal record in Maricopa County under his Social Security number. Someone had used Robert Miller's SSN to establish a false identity in Arizona. They had obtained a driver's license, opened bank accounts, and committed crimes under that identity. Every record created under the false identity was attached to Miller's number. When the criminal was arrested, the arrest record went to Miller's SSN. Miller's security clearance was denied. His job offer was rescinded. He spent 18 months and thousands of dollars in legal fees establishing that the person arrested in Phoenix was not him. His case is in the records of the House Subcommittee on Government Information and Individual Rights, 1982. He testified before the subcommittee. His testimony describes the specific documents he had to produce, the agencies he had to contact, and the absence of any centralized process for resolving identity theft cases involving Social Security numbers. The phrase identity theft did not exist as a legal category in 1981. It would not appear in federal law until 1998, when Congress passed the Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act. Between 1981 and 1998, there was no federal crime called identity theft. Using someone else's Social Security number to establish a false identity was a fraud offense, but the specific harm, the systematic takeover of another person's financial and legal identity through their SSN, had no dedicated legal framework. It had no framework because no one had anticipated that the number would become universal. The number was not supposed to be the key to everything. The card said, "Not for identification." The design assumed the number would live inside the Social Security Administration's earnings records, not inside every bank, credit bureau, government agency, and employer's database simultaneously. When the number became universal, it became a master key. And master keys, by definition, are the most valuable things a thief can acquire. The Federal Trade Commission began tracking identity theft complaints in 1992. In its first year of tracking, the FTC received approximately 35,000 complaints. By 2003, the number was 215,000. By 2015, it exceeded 490,000. The majority of identity theft cases involve the Social Security number as the primary point of compromise. This trajectory was predictable. It was predicted. In 1971, Sam Ervin told the Senate that concentrating so much identifying power in a single 9-digit number that could not be changed, that was impossible to verify in real time, and that was known to tens of thousands of institutions, was not a security design. It was a security catastrophe waiting to happen. His statement is in the record. Nobody changed the design. The SSN cannot be changed. This is not an oversight. It is a feature of the original architecture. The earnings record depends on continuity. If you could change your number, your earnings history would be interrupted. So the number you received at birth, or when you first applied, is the number you carry until you die. And because the number is permanent and universal, a single successful theft can compromise every record attached to it, financial, medical, legal, governmental, simultaneously and permanently. The Social Security Administration has issued replacement numbers in cases of severe documented identity theft. The process requires extensive documentation. The new number does not erase the old one. It exists alongside it. Old records still reference the compromised number. The theft is not undone. The damage is not reversed. A replacement number is a partial measure against a problem created by a design that the government implemented without authorization and cannot fully undo. Here is what the congressional record shows about how all of this was understood as it was happening. In 1973, a Department of Health, Education, and Welfare Advisory Committee published a report called Records, Computers, and the Rights of Citizens. The report is 346 pages long. It is available through HEW's successor department, Health and Human Services. The report's central finding was this: the Social Security number had become a de facto national identifier without legislative authorization, creating risks to individual privacy and security that would grow as computer systems became more capable of linking records across agencies and institutions. The report recommended that Congress pass legislation explicitly defining the permissible uses of the Social Security number and establishing legal protections against its misuse. Congress received the report, it held hearings, it passed the Privacy Act of 1974, which addressed some of the federal agency concerns, but left the private sector untouched. The HEW report's warning about the risks of linked computer systems was written in 1973. The Internet did not yet exist. The report was describing a future in which computers could connect records from different institutions using a shared identifier. That future arrived within 20 years. The SSN was the shared identifier. The risks the report described became the identity theft epidemic of the 1990s and 2000s. The report was filed. The warning was recorded. The design was not changed. You were given a number at birth. The government promised it would track your earnings and nothing else. Without asking you, without voting, without passing a law, the government and then every private institution in America attached that number to every significant record of your existence. When the attachment made the number the most valuable target for theft in American life, there was no mechanism to fix it, because the number cannot be changed, the records cannot be unlinked, and the promise made in 1936 cannot be retroactively enforced. The card in Arthur Altmeyer's office said, "Not for identification." The cards issued today do not say that. Nobody announced the change. Nobody voted on it. Nobody asked. The 1935 Act is in the National Archives. Altmeyer's testimony is in the congressional record. Carl Davis's letter to his congressman is in the files of the 88th Congress. Mary Calvert's testimony is in the Senate Judiciary Committee records. Robert Miller's testimony is in the House Subcommittee records. The HEW report is available through Health and Human Services. The documents were always there. The promise is in them. So is the record of how it was broken, one administrative decision at a time, until the breaking was so complete that the original promise became impossible to find unless you knew where to look. The Social Security Administration maintains an online portal where you can see your own earnings record. It is free. It takes 5 minutes to create an account. The record shows every year of reported earnings attached to your number, going back to your first job. It also shows you something else. If someone has used your number to work under a false identity, their earnings appear in your record. Wages you did not earn attached to your number because the employer reported them under your SSN and the SSA accepted the report. The SSA calls these earnings discrepancies. They are more common than the agency publicly acknowledges. The internal audit records are in the Inspector General's reports, which are public documents available through the SSA's website. The promise made in 1935 was that the number would track your earnings. It does. It also tracks everyone else who has ever used your number, whether you knew about it or not. Check your record. The portal is ssa.gov. The information has been there the whole time. Subscribe, because next week we open another file.